this is an exercise that you need to do really from the start. Um, you need to be thinking about these kind of things all the way through. I mean, there is a best practices and things like that, that, if you do them, then it makes it easier to create a roadmap. But it's also one of those things that I found, the sooner you have that in mind, that you have a picture beyond the current version you're working on, the better, because it does give you, it gives you a way to plan stuff out a little bit and prioritize, and not just say, it's in or out. It's, basically you allows you to say everything's in, just not necessarily this version. So in the beginning, when you're starting with your project, for anything else, when it was nothing but a little sketch on a napkin somewhere, from there you put together your requirements and a functional specification, and you had this vision of what this thing was going to be. Well, that vision is your complete vision. Usually that's not, your vision is usually not 1.0. You may hope it's 1.0, but let's face it, as you start getting into things and implementing, you'll realize usually that, oh, this feature doesn't really belong here yet, or this is going to cause me to wait another 6 months before I release, but I can come back and release this other stuff that's very useful, and then I'll come back with a 1.1 or a 2.1 release and put in some of these other features. So once you've got your bucket of requirements and your specifications, the roadmap is, the whole genesis of that is, okay, what of these things, of these requirements and these specifications, and to what completeness do they belong in version 1 or 1.1 or 1.2 or 2 or 3 or 16? You probably aren't going to go that far out, but you usually, it's not very hard to at least put together a couple of versions, a couple of minor versions, and even a couple of major versions ahead, as you're starting to think through, particularly startup type projects. For example, Michael's test generator, automated test generator, there's some things that are core that he knows he needs to have these for a product. But as we've learned talking over the last 6 months or a year, as we've had discussions about that, there's all kinds of other things out there that he'd like to have, or maybe better ability to capture screenshots, or work with different languages, or different platforms, and adding documentation and a lot of other stuff that, and it's like, oh, this would be great, but you can spend forever doing that would be great, that would be nice. So he puts it together, he laid down into a roadmap. Now, getting to version 1.0 is really what and I understand, yes, there are products out there that do they start with like 0.8, 0.9, 0.9.5, stuff like that. They don't really want to call themselves a 1.0 yet. I think that's just chickening out. I think you just put it at 1.0. This is my first release. You may have some pre-releases to it, but essentially, your release to the public, 1.0. And it doesn't, you can call it whatever you want, but really this is your first release, your first full release out. May have, essentially passed a beta. You may want to call 1.0 as actually a beta as well. That's a different topic. With your 1.0, an MVP, or minimum viable product, is, I think, the best thing to shoot for, particularly if this is a startup, a product that's not a spin-off product, something that you're trying to do, something that's not that necessarily is completely new, but in some way it's fairly, pretty much completely new, close to new. It may not be the newest idea, or it may not be that you've found a new way to solve something that nobody else has ever thought of again, but just it's your approach to it. That's something that doesn't have backing, I guess, for lack of a better term. So you're not actually piggybacking on anything else. You're launching this sucker. If you're piggybacking, or if you're building off of other stuff, then it may not be as much of an issue, because your minimally viable product, you can actually shoot beyond that because you have funding, you have revenue coming in, you somehow have it covered so that you've got a longer runway, and you can say, well, I can go beyond this before I have to actually release it. We'll talk a little later about whether even that is necessary. I don't know that I necessarily recommend that even in that case, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. Your minimal viable product, what is it? It is your key features. This is the stuff that for whatever problem you're solving for your users, this solves that problem. Maybe not pretty, maybe not the fastest way, but it solves the problem, which means it has value to them. If they use your product, it's going to make their life easier in some way, form, or fashion. If, for example, you may want to do something that's let's say it's a checkbook balancing application. People can do that. They have those features, but what you're going to provide them, your minimally viable product, would be some ability for them to enter their information, and it balances their checkbook for them. That's the problem you're solving, so you have to somehow solve that. If you give them something that all it does is allow them to print out their check register, probably not going to be worth it enough because they could do that today. The biggest problem with the minimum viable product that I have run into, and just in discussions with other people, I think they hit the same roadblock with this kind of stuff, is that people put together an MVP and they say, all right, this is what we're going to do. And then they add this, but it has to be pretty. It has to be eye-catching. It has to be snappy. It has to draw people to it. That's not solving the problem. That's solving your problem of selling that to other people. So the first problem I have with let's make sure it's pretty as well as a minimally viable product is, one, that you've added something on top of minimally viable product. So now you've increased scope, you've increased effort and costs and all that kind of other good stuff. More importantly is that the things that you do to make it pretty and aesthetically pleasing and all that is probably more likely it's for you or your group, your board, your experts, your subject matter experts, your key users, the couple of people that you're dealing, or maybe a lot of people, but the people you're dealing with to essentially build the solution. It's going to be for those people because that's the way it is. They're the ones giving you the feedback, so they're going to be the ones that are going to drive how that looks, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but early on, it doesn't hurt to get yourself in a situation where you can put this in front of external people, your actual customers, and get their feedback. Because until you get this thing to version 1.0, pretty much by definition, it's not out there. You haven't released it. So you're not able to get feedback other than in your own little echo chamber of people that are building it. And although you may understand a problem very well, you may have a lot of experts, there's still value, and because the people that are going to be your customers, there's obviously, I think, value to them giving you feedback and helping drive the process of what that becomes. And although you may have a really good group and you may guess, well, what this thing needs to look like and how it's going to be aesthetically pleasing, there is a very big risk that you're spending a lot of time prettying this thing up, in quotes, and then you end up having to throw it all away. And we've seen that. We have seen sites over the years, even Facebook at one point had, they went in and had this big surprise change that they were going to make to interface, and everybody was like, we're done, we're leaving, we hate you. They were just like, the reactions were very negative. And they're hardly the only company that's ever run into that, where somebody comes in and makes a few changes, and then the next thing you know, like, we need to backpedal off of that. If you're a big company, if you're Apple or IBM or Microsoft, you can backpedal off of that all day. You've got enough funding and momentum and things like that. If you're just, one of us that doesn't have a huge business behind us, then that may be a huge deal. That may be a big problem if we put 6 months into a project and then turn around and 5 of those months we basically have to, change, throw away, rewrite the code. It's very important with this, particularly with this first version, with the minimally viable project or product, is what is core. This is, what is the core functionality? What is the problem we're solving, and what do we need to do to solve that problem? Versus what are some of the other things that we're adding that are nice to have. And you may say need to have, but maybe you do, maybe you don't. And typically what you need to do with this, and that I think we get away from, is look back at the main problem and the ideal user. What's the problem you're solving, and who is your, as precise as you can get, target user, target market. If it's if it's something broad like this is for everybody in the continental United States, go back to the drawing board. That is not your ideal user. There's no product out there that hits that wide a market. You should be able to get it down to a person that's, as some people call it, an avatar, so that you can basically describe the kind of clothes they wear, the haircut they have, the kind of car they drive. It's like the more you can get down to very specific details of this person is exactly the person that we want for a customer. This is a person that we are building this thing for. That's where your core functionality is what can we give, what are we going to give them that they have to have, because this is a minimal, not, nice to have viable product, but a minimally viable product. What is it that we have to give them enough that they are going to give us money for this product? With your, so as you're going through, you get your core functionality, and now any feature that you're going to decide to, yay or nay, keep it or push it to the next release. Simple question. Does this contribute to solving that main problem? Does this address the issue we're trying to address? Or, which happens a lot, is this like a convenience or a helper kind of thing? A great example of this is integrations with other systems. A lot of times, whatever you write, whatever application you do, if you're pulling data in, you could either allow users to enter it just raw, record by record. Now, if it's thousands or tens of thousands of records, that probably isn't, that's not going to be useful enough. Then you step it up to, well, we're going to have like a hard coded, maybe it's an XML or a CSV or fixed format or some other delimited, text file that they can upload. Or maybe even not even upload, they're going to copy and paste this stuff into a field, and then we'll submit it to the web application and it'll parse it. Not the most convenient thing in the world, but hey, it does the job. And it may be so that's a convenience. That may not actually be required. In a lot of cases, it's not. It's stuff where people say, well, I'm not sure this is useful enough, but and by that, I mean, it's not useful enough if we don't have this nicer import wizard or export wizard or something like that. That may be the case, but if that's the case, then it needs to be part of your main problem. That needs to be part of your main problem definition, is that we have to do this and we have to be able to cleanly integrate with this application or this other user data. Otherwise, it becomes pointless to them. So you may have to adjust your problem definition. Anything else, it may be really nice to have. It may dramatically increase the number of customers you're going to have, but that's not your target at 1.0. It's get something that is functionally solid. And of course, the most important question on whether you scope it or not is, keep it in or push it to a future, is, can it wait? Is this something that we could put off? Is this thing really useful that somebody could use it today, but it'd be nice to have this other stuff? Well, if they can use it today, then that can it wait disappears. Administration tools are like almost always fall in this bucket, especially first version. You can manually administer the heck out of applications. You can have something where they, the administration is, they send you an email and say, can you do this, this, and this? And you're like, okay, it's a pain in the butt for you. Maybe it's not the most clean thing for them, but if your functionality is out there and useful, then wait on the admin stuff. And reporting can sometimes fall into this this area as well. Those are just a few of the things that show up regularly. Some examples of core functions would be the user ability to enter data. Just about every application we have these days, there's got to be some way for the user to provide input to utilize the application. There's not very many things out there that are useful by, you don't have to really give it any other input than starting it or pressing a button or something like that. They do exist, but usually there's got to be some way to enter some data, provide some sort of input into the application. The happy path is the core functionality. It's basically, if you use this app, you want to do step 1, step 2, step 3, and they should have these following results. That's, if you improperly enter some data, or if you have some typos, or if you forget to take one of the steps and do what you're supposed to do, those are outside of the happy path. So you may want to, you may have the ability as you're building this stuff to handle a few of those exceptions, but it's one of those things that the more the more you put into that, the more you're going to push back your launch date. Clean data processing, and by that I mean processing clean data, is a core function. Like I said, if they put in junk, if they put in typos and things like that, there's always a desire to put some validation and some corrections and some things that you can do to help a user out, but you're helping a user out. You're not actually solving the core function at that point. Usable output is a core function. There's got to be some sort of, they're going to do it and they get some sort of feedback, but it doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be a formatted report. It may be that your first version, that all you do is you kick out like a little screen of data, or a text file or something like that. You don't have to get all, it doesn't have to be all formatted and bolds and colors and have emails and text messages that go out and things like that. It's really, again, and this is where you can spend weeks, months playing around with stuff. If you have not been in a situation where you have spent hours going over, like, aligning some field or getting some font or size just right and getting everything so it fits on a paper and prints prettily, then God bless you. You have missed one of the most painful experiences you can go through in software development. So avoid it where you can on your minimally viable product. Don't go down that rabbit hole. Non-core functions, a big one that is always a good one to push off is preferences and user customization. You may have to do one or two things as part of the user data input, but for the most part, things like allowing them to select a color scheme, or how the format the data comes out in, or the format they input stuff in, time zones are in, all that kind of stuff, that can always be pushed off to version 1.1 or later. Perfect wording and grammatically correct errors, notifications, emails, all that kind of stuff, you can keep it very simple early on. Things like, hey, an error occurred, this is where it occurred. You want it useful enough for yourself, so if somebody does call and says, I've got an error, you've got at least enough information to work with it. But you can, again, spend a lot of time wordsmithing your way through things like welcome emails and notification emails, like this process ran. Those kind of things you can push to a future release. Pixel perfect layouts, that goes back to exactly what I was talking about on reports, and really just to beat that dead horse, just beautiful reports, definitely a non-core function. So now we get into building the roadmap. I talked about at the start, one of the first reasons that you want to have a roadmap is it's a place for future enhancements. You have features and functionality that you got to have, and you prioritize those things. You say, these are things we need to have, these are nice to have, these are the cool to haves, these are the, wow, this may help a little bit, and these are the things that if we got nothing better to do, I guess we'll go ahead and throw those things on there, because it's just an idea we had. All of those add up to your roadmap. And once you get past version 1.0, all of these things, all of the aesthetic type stuff, your reporting, your output, the those kinds of things, you're going to be better off because you push those beyond your minimally viable product. You're going to be better off because you can use your customer feedback to really craft and mold those things into something that is taking your users into account and not you essentially dictating to them how things should look or how things should be done. There is some of that you're going to have to do as part of getting that core functionality in there, but wherever you can use user feedback and build for your community versus building for yourself, it's going to help your likelihood of being a success. And if for nothing else, then if the community feels like they have contributed to building it, they're going to be that much more likely to be open to it and want to support it. Once you get into your post like version 1.0, as you're going through things, you should have a lot of your new features actually should be driven by feedback and from real users. You can be spending some time in blue sky sessions or greenfield sessions, whatever the name or label you want to use, but essentially, those are you sort of stepping out of what you've got today and thinking out of the box a little bit and saying, okay, well, where can we lead this thing next? And that's usually going to be more like, version 2.0, 3.0, like big features, big changes. That's the kind of stuff that you're probably going to do because you're in this context all the time. You're solving this problem. You're talking to your users. You're getting feedback. You're understanding their environments and their situations and their processes. And so that's going to allow you to gather all of that together, almost like a bunch of your users getting into a room, and if they wanted to solve it, they would come up with these ideas, somewhat as well. That's what they're going to rely on you for. But a lot of that's going to come from, at least the germs of those are going to come from, real users and feedback and what they would like to do and how your solution works or maybe doesn't work for them. So let's talk about point releases. So you get past version 1.0, what typically should be a point release? And it's not really, it used to be an industry standard of how these things work. They've sort of drifted away from it just because people like to do dated releases or code name releases. So they do like the spring 2018 release of X, or they're going to do the bullfrog release of X. They pick some little cutesy name or something like that. Not to pick on like Apple, for example, but they just sort of hide. They don't really spend time on the versions. And there is, now that being said, like Apple does still have versions to their to all their releases. So if you go look at, for example, my Mac, I'm sitting here running on version 10.13.3 of High Sierra. So they're going to talk about High Sierra, but this is really the version that we're on. So point releases, though, are typically going to be not huge things. This is not going to be your sea change. These are going to be your smallest stuff. So one would be what I call hidden fixes. These are the things that are maybe like performance tuning, bugs that are not seen very often, but may cause problems down the road, scalability type fixes, things like that. Minor improvements, so maybe you can reduce a click here or there for navigation, maybe a little bit of simplifying a process, or adding, tweaking how like an integration works. So if part of your original, what you have today is that you integrate with, let's say, CSV, that you can import comma separated files. Maybe a minor improvement would be that you add the ability that it could be it could be a tab separated or pipe separated or hashtag separated or whatever you want to do, something like that. Minor improvements. Your point releases really should be, they're also sometimes called fix releases. And that's really where you should be, you should be focusing on corrections to things that are there. If there's any bugs, squashing those things. And you may throw a new item in or not, but usually that muddies the water. The one thing that I've seen that sometimes is helpful is people sort of do a trial flag, a trial balloon version of a feature. So they'll throw something in and say, hey, we're testing out this new thing. Tell us what you think. So it's really just to get an idea in front of customers, but it's almost like a a side feature of the product. It's not just necessarily something that's in the primary flow, or maybe something they can turn on and off. Particularly like people try sometimes a UI change or something like that. They'll say, well, we're going to put this in this point release, but it's not 100%. It's essentially a beta. Let us know your thoughts. Usually your point releases, you're going to have pretty tight, or specific release dates. You're going to be down probably to like a day or a week that you're going to have on your roadmap, because it's not that far off. So you should know, I'm going to do it. I'm going to turn this thing out at the end of the month. I'm going to turn this out at the end of next month. Those kinds of things. You're sort of a smaller scale, so you should be able to have a pretty tight estimation of the time and when it's going to be available. With any of these things, you got to remember that working is better than looking good. That's the key. Functionality and simple feature sets that work are much better than complex ones that are whiz bang and have a lot of bells and whistles but don't always work. Simple, keep it simple, Sam. That KISS method is definitely the thing that you want to keep in account, keep in your mind as you're putting these things together. And that should be how your roadmap sort of evolves, is start with the very simple, start with things, nail those things, and make those things work, be sure of them, certain of them, and then you can start building on them as you get into further releases. Because now you have a firm foundation, a foundation of code and functionality and users and everything that works. It's an understood problem. So you can add this new stuff on top of it and be pretty sure that if something goes wrong, it's either an integration or the new stuff that you've put on it, not something that was in that foundational set of work that you did. One of the things that I know I pick on look and feel a lot, but that does, I think, a lot of time. I've spent too many times, personal experience, having discussions with customers over things where I look back and it's like, wow, we just spent an hour talking about whether to use a comma or not. There's things like that you look back and go, man, that was a complete waste. And I don't know that 99% of our users are even going to care. And the 1% that do are probably going to be torn. Half of them are going to hate it and half of them are going to love it. It's things like that. But just to beat the dead horse again a little bit, you think about it. Is it a pretty or highly impressive interface is not understood until it's in front of somebody. If you give somebody an application that is functional, they're just going to say, okay, I'm going to go use this. Now, if you come back in a year and you've got their version 2.0 and it's not only functional, but it's sexy. It does everything in an awesome way, and people just love using your product just to use your product. They didn't know that until you put that in front of them. So it's not like the people that buy it version 1.0 are like, well, it works, but man, it'd be nice if this was a really, cool looking experience. They're not going to know that till later. Later on, they're going to say, wow, this is really great. This is a huge improvement. I really love how this works. I love working in your product more than I ever did in the past. It's just it's the difference between being a white collar worker and a blue collar worker. It's like, hey, if you go in and you need to have a hard hat and overalls, it's functional. Now, if somebody goes out and builds a 3-piece suit that does all of that same functionality, people will be like, wow, that's what we've needed all along. So people look really slick on the work site. And maybe I'm getting a little sarcastic or facetious, but that's the key, is that people don't know until they've seen it. So if you put it off, it's not probably going to it's usually not going to cause you any kind of issues. If there's something that's expected, it's expected to see things work a certain way or look a certain way, that's different. If it's you impressing people with a new approach or a new look and feel, they're not going to realize the value that's there until you've given it to them. And honestly, if you give them something that's like plain vanilla and then you come back and give them the thing with the icing on top, they're going to appreciate the icing on top more, because they're going to say, wow, plain vanilla was not terribly, that was plain, but this is awesome. That being said, that's in the front end and stuff like that. The back end of that, the architecture is key. Early on, you should be really focused on things that probably are not going to be that visible to users initially, but it is nailing the architecture. What is the platform that you're building it on? What does the database look like? How do those structures interact? What kind of data are you going to be able to capture, and how is it going to relate to other data that you capture? These are the things that are huge for maintainability, for scalability, for performance, all of the most important things about the features being useful to users and in a consistent basis. So spend that time, take a little bit of that time that you would have been prettying things up, and turn around and focus it on the architecture, on making sure that the foundation is secure. Major releases now, we talk about the point releases, moving on to major releases. These usually, this is one definitely where you're getting any kind of like big noticeable change to users, make it a major release. Jump from 1.0 to 2.0 or 2.0 to 3.0. This is, that's going to let them know almost by itself that, hey, there's sizable change or a large number of changes in this major release. You can do like if you go from 1.0 to 2.0, and there are products that have done it where they have done a complete user interface overhaul. Websites as well, where they just completely redesign the website and they say, well, this is our 2.0 of our website. You can do that, but there is a risk. If you overdo it, if you completely change how everything works in the user experience to a level where your existing customers are negatively impacted because they get in the habit of doing it the way that you've presented it to them in the past. Well, if you change it so that way of the things that they used to do and the way that they used to do it, now, this new way, it's going to be confusing or causes them the challenges in trying to get those things done. Save it. Don't find a way to like maybe incrementally work to it, because if you overdo it, you could just take your entire user base and alienate them. And particularly your power users and the people that use it a lot. If you do a major overhaul, they're going to be the ones impacted the most, and they're also going to be the most vocal ones to let you know about it. As you get into your roadmap and putting major releases on it, because they're major and because they're a bigger scope, you're probably spending usually at least 3 to 6 months is going to go into a major release. So you're spending enough time that, having a sort of vague date of which quarterly is like most companies are famous. We're going to get it by fourth quarter of 2018. And of course, I think most of us now know that if they say fourth quarter 2018, that means they're going to ship it to somebody on December 31st, but it's probably still not going to be generally available until, mid-January or February of the next quarter. And that's usually the way those things go. And that's okay. You can be a little bit vague and say what's coming in July or, third quarter this year, something like that. You can keep those vague on your roadmap because they are going to change. Scope's going to change on those things. You have a roadmap of 10 features that are going to go into this major release. Well, when you actually get to it, there may be 100 features going to go into there because you're going to have some little fixes and you're going to have some adjustments that have come in that are just, if nothing else, lessons learned. Now that you've gotten a version out in front of people, you've gotten feedback from them. That's going to start informing those releases. So you leave yourself some wiggle room. As you're going through building out your roadmap, though, don't forget the basics. This is something that we do a lot where if you have a roadmap that slips a lot, that's probably what you're doing is you're forgetting some of the other things that go into putting a release together. And these are things like, documenting it, whether it's release notes or updating help or sending stuff out to your customers and getting feedback from them, testing, and then the scope and the impact of that as well as, you may make some changes that are very minor and there's not a whole lot of testing required, or you may make some that are of a sort where the entire thing has to be completely retested. And if you don't have automated regression testing or anything like that, then that could be a sizable amount of time that is spent just on going back through and testing and documenting any bugs that are found and squashing the bugs. And of course, these things, your documentation, your testing, and some of those things don't actually fall into the minimally viable product scope of stuff. You need to test it, but you don't have to have automated scripts. You don't have to have some sort of automated test tool. You don't have to have templates for your documents. You can keep it pretty fast and loose and do it manually and things like that. You may not want to, because it may be a case where you're going to be spending enough time going through releases and testing releases and regression testing and things like that, where you may say, all right, this does have to be something that maybe it's not for the users, but for us, we have to solve this problem by version 1. Otherwise, it's going to be too much of a pain to try to implement it later. But you should be, regardless of what you've done, as you're going through these processes of building a release and documenting a release and testing a release and deploying your release, you're learning how to do this better. So along the way, you should be refining your processes and finding ways to improve them and even automate them along the way. So hopefully version 10, when you get to that point, is a lot smoother process than releasing version 1.0. If it's not, you either really were awesome on 1.0 or you really suck by version 10.0. You really have not learned. So once you've got your major features, your minor feature type things, your fixes and stuff like that you're going to have to address down the road, laying out a roadmap, usually for any decent sized organization, you probably want to start at least at an annual scope. A lot of them like to do 2, 3 to 5 year scope initially of this year we're going to work on this, next year we're going to work on that, the year after that we're going to work on this other thing. And if you get into IT assessments and audits and things like that, you will get those kinds of questions. What's your 5-year plan for your organization? It may not be maybe something you can put down in 1 or 2 lines, or you may have a roadmap where you've got a very detailed approach where you're going to build this version, you're going to go build that version, you're going to do this spinoff product, you're going to do this other thing over here, and then that's your roadmap. Once you've got your sort of your broad features, sets, and types of releases you're going to do, then you start breaking that down. So you've got it, like this year I'm going to put version 1 and version 2 out, and version 1's my minimally viable product. I'm going to solve these problems. By version 2, I'm going to go back and solve these other 2 secondary problems. That's your annual thing. Now break it down into quarterly targets, essentially, and say, okay, if I'm going to do 2 this year, I'm going to do 1 by July 1st, and the other one's going to, or let's say June 30th, the other one's going to go out by December 31st. And then with that, now you've got some rough time targets, so you can start fitting in what can fit into version 1 and then what's going to have to wait for version 2. And then from there, once you've got those things, those buckets sort of filled, essentially, then you should be able to take those and take a step, 1 step deeper and start building out a list of milestones and deliverables and maybe even point releases and things like that. So that you'll be able to say, okay, version 1 is going to come out in June. Let's say you've got version 1. So version 2 is going to come out in June, but at the end of February, I'm going to have version 1.1 out that I'm going to address these couple of fixes, and I'm going to have these couple of little minor new features. And then version 1.2 comes out in April, and here's the additional features, and here's what I'm going to be looking to have in that release. That's your next step down. Once you've gotten to that point, you have a roadmap. You have, here's what I'm working on and when I expect to get it done. It's important to remember when you're going through this process, and you should go through this process. You don't have to, but I think I highly recommend it. It's just one of those things that if you do it, it makes your life a lot easier in software development. It actually gives you some focus and does a lot to keep you from falling into death marches and just randomly adding features that end up being not terribly useful to your users. So the roadmap is not, it's for you to do you, the development team, you, the developer, to keep a focus and keep your eye on the prize, essentially. But it's also for the customers so that they have an idea of what's coming up, what kind of features are there, you know, what are your plans? You know, it's going to give them some comfort to you, you know, in working with you and buying your product if they know that this is not the only version I'm ever going to see. Even if it's something like, you know, Angry Birds or something like that, where they could have just sat on their butt and said, "Here you go, here's an app, here's some birds blowing stuff up." You know, they went in and now there's different birds and there's different locations and some things like that. You know, they may not have published a roadmap. I don't know if they did or not, but somewhere along the way they created one, maybe after the fact. But if they'd put it together and said, "Oh, by the way, we're going to do, you know, Angry Birds is going to come out this year, and then next year we're going to add all of these things to Angry Birds." That's and if you know, if you own it, then you automatically get it. Or hey, then that'll give you a way to step up to Angry Birds 2, you know, stuff like that. Customers are going to appreciate that. They're going to feel like it's more real. Now, for games like Angry Birds, that may not matter as much, you know, because you know I get my game and I'm happy with it. But you know, especially if it's the first one you've ever seen. You know, if it's if Elder Scrolls came out today and there was no history of it, then people may look at it and say, "Wow, this is all like, yeah, Skyrim, say it comes out today and everybody says, oh, it's a great game, I like it." You know, that's one thing. They'll say, they may, you know, look at it as, okay, it's a standalone and I'm happy with it. But if they know that, oh yeah, we've got this, and then we're going to come out with a follow-up sort of like this, but we're going to be in a different location, you know, in 2 years, and then a couple of years after that, we've got this other one that we've got in the works. It's going to make people a little more excited to do that kind of stuff, and maybe draw them in, particularly applications, because especially business applications, because if you are going to be adding features, then what you're doing is you're expanding the pool of people that it's useful for as you add those features on. You know, you've got to get some customers, you got to really solve the problem for them. But then beyond that, you get to the people that would sort of like to have that problem solved, but they need something more to make it worthwhile for them to purchase it. Since you've done this, share it. It should be visible within the development team. There should not be some secret master plan. It should be something the development team at least knows about. And your customers, not necessarily to the same detail. You don't have to like list out every bug, although, you know, using Jira and some of that kind of stuff, those tools do make that fairly easy and does give a lot of comfort to customers for them to know that, hey, I called in, I had this problem, I had this bug, they said they were going to fix it. I can see where it's on the roadmap, so I can check in with them in a month when they're supposed to have fixed it. And yeah, they're going to be that much happier and that much more confident in your ability to professionally produce software. So I highly recommend you share it to your customers as well. And of course, like I said, auditors and assessors, people like that are going to, anybody that's looking at the health of your organization, a roadmap is going to help them feel better about it. You put this roadmap out, and you shared it. And part of that whole thing, besides informing all of them, is also to give yourself accountability. You put dates there, so you need to hit them. If you want to earn respect and trust of your customers, then hit those dates. You know, they should, if they get to the point where they say, well, you know, here's the roadmap, they said this is going to be out by June, it's going to be out by June. That's huge. You'll get customers you wouldn't have otherwise, simply because you're good on your word, that you hit your dates. That will wrap this one up. As always, appreciate, you know, thanks for listening. Thanks for allowing me to wander through this little presentation and the idea of a roadmap, because it is a wandering kind of thing. You know, we always sit down and maybe we have a few milestones or road markers in our mind, but as you get into actually building out a roadmap, it is always a more fungible kind of process where things are going to flow in and out, and you're going to probably even redefine a few things along the way. That being said, if you have any questions, comments, requests for assistance, want examples of roadmaps that you know, how would I put one together, all of that kind of good stuff, or anything related to it, shoot me an email, info@developreneur.com. You can always contact us on the site. You can go out there, you can leave comments on any of the blog posts out on the podcast. We've got a contact us form. You can sign up and get on the weekly or the monthly emails. Join up here at the mastermind, attend and ask a question at that point. As always, you know, the goal is just making better developers everywhere. all levels. And this is one of those things that if you do it, regardless of where you're at, whether you're just starting out or whether you've been doing this for 20 or 30 years, this is one of those things that you should be doing. And the better you do it, the better you're going to be as a developer. Now I will open it up for questions. Are there any questions, comments, feedback?
I struggle with some of the issues you brought up on this, especially with release 1, trying to get out of beta with my software product. But the biggest problem I have, and one of the things you didn't really, I don't think you really touched on it, but your end user, yes, you just got to make it feasible enough for them to get in, configuration files, things of that nature. But depending upon the complexity of your product, for example, mine requires some bit of setup initially because version 1, or basically to get it out the door, it's pretty crude. I mean, it will take someone to have some training or, needs to figure out how to do all these setting files. I think I need to simplify that a little bit. Now, granted, I don't think I need to do that for release 1, but I'm kind of torn between that because some part of me says that if it's too complicated and the person that uses this needs to be a developer, then that blows my target out of the water, because I really want this to be for testers, not necessarily developers.
All of these things are easier said than done. I'll put it that way. I think you said it yourself, as this stuff that doesn't necessarily have to be in version 1, and that's where that challenge is. Now, in your case, what you can do is say, hey, for version 1, there's some setup, but if you purchase this product, one of the things I'll do is I'll sit down with you for, with your people for whatever it takes, 15 minutes or half hour or whatever, and I'll do the setup for you. And a lot of applications, particularly complicated ones, that's what they do is early on, sometimes forever, they include part of the part of the cost, part of the service, part of the product is installation and setup. And that's actually it's actually a prime example of something where over time, as I talked about with like testing and deployment, is that you want to get better. A lot of places have done, they sort of turn it, it's a loss early on, but they end up turning it into a way to make a little bit of money, because what they do is they say, I'm going to sell you my product for $1,000. For $100, and there's going to be extra $100 that is a setup fee, a setup and install fee, and we're going to set up and install it for you. And they'll say, okay, well, the first couple of times you do it, it's very manual, it's very time consuming, it may take hours and hours of work to do, so that you end up losing money on that extra money you charge for the install. However, as you get better at it, as you get past version 1.0, maybe that's where you start seeing where, oh, hey, we can add this little tool, we can add this little tool. And you get to the point where it's like, okay, now we're earning enough, the hours we put into this is matching what we're getting paid for it. And then eventually you may get to the point where you've automated it so that the time you put into it is actually less than what your normal rate would be for the install. And then maybe at some point that becomes a feature where you say, you know what, we've gotten to this point where you don't need any technical skills. You can just use these couple tools, hit these couple buttons. Here's a couple fields you have to enter. These are where you find those values, and you're off and running. So I think that's a great example of something that you want to push past version 1.0 and find what is it that, again, just like anything else, the minimally viable product, what has to be capable, what is it that has to be there for you to be able to sell it? And if your struggle is, I don't want them to have developers to set this up, that's fine. But that's where, if you can set it up, then you can just say, hey, by the way, and you can charge them or not. I mean, it may be something where you say, if you just buy it, I will throw this in for free. I will spend some time. I will walk through the setup with your people. It's risky because they may have a really jacked up environment and it may take a lot of time to go through that, but it's a learning experience for you as well.
Right. Okay. And little things like that. It just, I'm working on getting some more beta clients before I go live, just because I want to get in front of more people before I say here, because I'm sure there's still a lot of things that I've missed in certain environments. I've been trying to create multiple environments, and the screening app that we worked on a long time ago that you're repurposing looks great, and I've had no problems using my tool on it, which you should get that this week, by the way. It's just one of those where it gets you there, but I don't necessarily want to get it out there and then have people have buyer's remorse.
Well, I think that's the challenge. That's what we run into with this stuff, is that you keep going into it and saying, well, I really want this, I really want that, I want that, because you want the customer to be really happy. But a thing I didn't even cover in this is that part of it is, if you give them everything they want in version 1, why do they buy version 2? That's the Windows XP example, basically. If you give them everything they need, they're going to say, I'm done, I have everything I need, I don't need anything else, this thing works, it's there. And that may be what you want to deliver to them. And if you do that, if you have a record of version 1.0 of my products, you're never going to want to buy version 1.1 even, because it's that good. You can make you can build a company off of that, but that means that means you really have to push out getting 1.0 out there. Now, in your case, you do have a little bit of a you have a little gray area there, because and that's what it's there for, is because you have essentially a beta period, so you can get some stuff out there and redefine maybe what your minimally viable product is. Because if you can get this out, if you go for the minimum and get that in front of somebody as a beta customer, you're going to get feedback from them that probably is going to say, in there's probably going to be a couple things where you look at it and you say, my minimum was not actually the minimum. I thought I could get away with this, but really I've got to add these couple extra features, or I've got to address this other situation that they're running into, or this other facet of the problem that they need to solve. Because if I don't, then it just really doesn't, it's not going to be useful enough. It's going to go out there and flop. And there is, you do want to put their first impression to be the best, but that's again where, if you have something that's functionally solid, that's rock solid, you don't have bugs, you don't have performance issues, you don't have scalability issues, it may not be the prettiest thing in the world, but that's what, people will respect that and will come back to you for a later version, because they know that what you put together works.
Yeah, I've actually pulled out a lot of features from the core for the initial release for this beta, just to keep it tight. But in the process of doing that, I realized that there is a lot of setup involved to get it going initially. So I guess I can use the beta clients, like you were saying, to go in and just eat the time up front and hopefully get the payout later.
Yeah, and you can do, the nice thing about that approach is that you're going to be able to go in there and you can build little ugly scripts that you know how to use, and that may not be as useful to them, but at least it allows you to get that process done quickly and consistently. And then you can always come back later and maybe slap a nice, pretty interface on them or something like that. So you can, like I said, incrementally just get a little better, a little better, a little better in doing this. And that allows you to get something out there and get feedback and get revenue, get the thing sold to somebody, so that that yes, there are people out there that'll buy this. And unless it's something, because unless you're building a product that is really primarily for your own use, and then you're also going to sell it, probably Timothy's website may be a good example of that, as he built it for himself, and it's there's a market for it, but he's happy just using himself as well, at least was for a while there. So those kind of situations, it's a little different, because there you're not really, you can play around with it, you can do some extra things that are to help yourself out, and maybe they go into the main product and release it, maybe not. But any app, if you're to me, if you're a halfway decent developer at all, if you care at all about writing code, every time you go into an app and start playing around with it, you're going to come back with some idea somewhere of, I could do this a little better, I could do that a little better, and you can spend the rest of your life, perfecting your application.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say about that, like really just defining a minimally viable product, that MVP, might be my biggest weakness because again, I don't know so much to say this so freely, but like Michael, just I want to wrap in so much into that first product. So I get that. This is a good presentation.
Yeah, it is, and that is the thing, is that it's, like I said, it's much easier said than done. You get in there and you look at it and you say, oh, I can do this, I can do that. And sometimes you can. Sometimes you can work in little things, because we know there's some changes we can make that are little tweaks and adjustments and improvements that don't change the overall stability. They're not things that are, it's not a big impact. It's like, oh, I can go in and I can bold this text. It takes me 2 seconds. I'm here anyways. It'll clean it up. Great. But the problem with any of those kinds of things is that sometimes you do something and you're like, oh, I can bold this text. And then you end up putting a broken, maybe you forget to complete a bracket and it breaks the text. And then the next thing, sometimes somebody looks at it, it doesn't look right. And then you got to go track it down. And sometimes those rabbit holes can get very deep and lengthy. So,
Yeah.
It really is going back to, why am I doing this? And it goes back to having some requirements or some use cases, user stories, things like that, so that you can say, this is what my focus needs to be. And it gives you a litmus test to say, does this address the focus? Does this address the problem I'm trying to solve? Or is it something nice to have?
Yeah, and like you were talking about, the what'd you say, Timothy?
That MVP, minimally viable product.
Yeah, the MVP with mine, I've got it, like I said, I've got it down, but the issue I ran into is, as I really pushed it down to be the minimal, I accidentally introduced the configuration issue, which led to, all right, now it's not quite hitting, it's borderline hitting my target market, because what the tool does is it generates a test suite. And once you have the test suite, then you're good to go. However, to get to the test, to the part of building it, you have a lot of configuration now. But I like the idea, again, like Rob said, to just go in and set up some training within the initial cell to set that up and come back and build the GUIs later, because essentially what I need a GUI config that they can just go in, have a nice little GUI, enter everything in one place, instead of going and searching for the 4 settings files there are if they have Jira and other pieces to configure. So I think I'll take that approach. But that's just something to be careful, though, is if you're trying to do a minimal viable product, and in your case, you keep kind of like me, you keep wanting to add bells and whistles, but I stopped doing that back in November, and I started actually pulling things out to get it more stable so I can be released and get out in front of customers. It's just, there's that borderline you got to watch. You just got to be careful with that, because yes, you could add too much, but in the same token, you can take away too much. And then your product, yes, it's stable, yes, it's solid, but you're maybe not quite ready enough, or you've kind of gone back a little too far in your cleanup.
And that's a good, part of when I initially put this topic down, what I was working through at the time was I was on the Screen app, and I was playing around with that, because that thing's been in my head, and we've had discussions for years. So there's a whole lot of functionality that's been had floating around, and had thought I had that down to the right level of minimally viable product. Well, when I started getting into actually like full system testing it and going through stuff, I started looking at it and it's like, this doesn't really, it works, but not really. It's like, it's one of those things that it works, but it's such a pain in the butt to make it work. And I don't want to, have to, I don't want to have to do it for people. That's because that's part of what I'm looking at here too, is like a, sort of a passive kind of product where I don't have to go out and, consult with people and help them figure out how to use it. Then there's some things where I say, it's not really minimally viable. So I've actually I scoped up some of this stuff and, went back and looked at a few things, said, okay, I do need to change this, do need to change that. There's some minor things that I've tackled as well, like, look and feel. There's some things there where looking at it across the several different browsers that I needed to, that I was working with, I said, this is not, this doesn't cover what I needed to cover. This doesn't do what I needed to do. It doesn't look right. It's jacked up. So if you look at one browser, you get this way. If you look at this other browser, it looks completely different. So, or you can't find the data that you need in some of these cases. It's that kind of stuff that I actually was, and it was tough not adding a bunch to that, because there's several cases where I had a feature. I was like, oh, if I had this, then it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and add this other thing too. And of course, that's where you get into that little trail of, oh, well, let's just keep adding stuff and adding stuff and adding stuff. And so I had to, but I had the roadmap out there. So there was several things that I did, like a 1.0, 1.1, 1.2 release. And that's where I was sort of, 1.1 I got out, and then 1.1 and 1.2 was actually sort of correcting my initial missed MVP target. And then the rest of the stuff, as I looked at it, I said, okay, well, this is coming in, version 1.3 or 2 or whatever future version. So at least I track that, hey, I had that idea. Hey, there's this thing I want to do. And with it being out there on a roadmap, you can look at it and say, oh, yeah, we did talk about that. We do want to get that in a future release and move on, as opposed to you're sort of reinventing the wheel and coming back every so often and saying, oh, hey, this would be a great feature. Did we talk about this for? I can't remember if we did. So you can hit it from both ways.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Question for you, Rob. When you're designing, when you're doing the roadmap, do you have to have like a time frame, let me say, for 1.0? And when you say, you know what, I gotta go back to the drawing board, maybe the thing is not working out, and maybe revamp and come up with it?
Yes and no. You probably need to have, you probably have a time frame, because for every product, there's a window of opportunity where, if you don't get it out, it's going to be, time is going to pass, and it's just either somebody else is going to get it done, or it's just not going to be that useful, because the world has moved on. It'd be like creating a new, horse whip for buggies. You could have the greatest horse whip idea ever, but it's not going to sell a lot these days because nobody needs to whip horses. It's things like that. So there is some sort of time frame. There's also just your kind of time frame, depending on whether if it's a side hustle where you're building this thing on your own and you're putting your own blood, sweat, and tears into it, and it's not, this isn't your day job, then you can let stuff drag out a little bit longer. But even then, there's the opportunity cost. You're doing this instead of whatever else you could be doing. If this is your bread and butter, then you got to get it out at a certain amount of time, because if it doesn't get out and start making money, then you're starving, or something like that. So there is a time frame that makes sense on these. That being said, there are some. I created a game years ago, and I think I spent 3 years before I got to version 1.0. It was mostly because I was having fun just going through the process and doing it. And I, if I had time, I did it, and if I didn't, I didn't. I didn't keep myself on any kind of a schedule for it, which probably meant it went a lot longer than it should have been. I could have probably cranked that thing out a year or two earlier and probably been much happier with the results and, gotten a decent little customer base out of it. But I didn't because, I puttered along. And that's really the goal with the roadmap, is to not do that, is to get yourself in a situation where you're accountable to it. And it needs to be, version 1.0, it depends on the level of the size of the application. If it's something that it's going to take a year to get done, then version 1.0 doesn't need to come out, sooner than a year. If it's something that you should be able to sit down and knock it out in a month, then 1.0 should probably be coming out in a month or two. It's again, it varies so much from project to project and what your goals are, but that should be in your mind as you're putting your roadmap together, is how important is it for these things to come out when I've got them on the roadmap. And that's actually part of what you get out of the roadmap, is that once you put it down on paper, you may look at it and say, God, this thing isn't even going to hit the market for 2 years. Do I even want to do it? Because that's going to be, maybe the market's not going to be as hot at that point. If it's, let's say it's, last year you came up with let's say 18 months ago, you came up with an Obama related product that really only was going to matter while Obama was in office. So you look at it and you say, shoot, it's going to take me a year to get it done. He will have been 6 months out of office before I got the product out there. Well, why bother? It's one of those, like, I'm pretty sure the window of opportunity will have closed shut at that point. And you're going to have those kinds of aha moments as you're putting stuff on your roadmap, which may be nice, because if you've got an overall roadmap of what you're working on, there may be some things there that, laying them all out and putting them down on paper, you look at it and say, oh, here's something that I'm probably better off not even attempting. It would be, rather than looking at it, hindsight and saying, wow, that was a waste of time, you may be able to be up front say, wow, that's going to be a waste of time.